Winifred Calloway was 29 years old and had exactly $11 to her name when she stood at the edge of her husband's grave and understood that the ground beneath her feet no longer belonged to her. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Calloway, who had done it, riding onto the ranch not 3 days after Thomas was buried, waving a paper from the county bank that claimed a debt none of them had ever heard spoken of in life. And by week's end, the sheriff himself stood in the yard while she carried her trunk to the road. She had nothing left but that trunk, a good wool coat, and the $11 folded into her glove. It was with 7 of those dollars gone to a room above the mercantile, and 4 remaining in her palm, that she wandered to the county auction outside Coldwater Flats, Kansas, in the autumn of 1887, and there, among broken plows and a lame mule nobody wanted, she paid $4 for a windmill so rusted and bent that the auctioneer had nearly forgotten to call its number. Folks around her laughed under their breath, certain the widow Calloway had finally lost what little sense grief had left her. They did not know, and neither did she, not yet, that sealed inside the hollow iron blades of that ruined machine was a secret that would unravel a fraud 20 years old and put right a wrong that had been quietly strangling the whole town's future. A discovery that would leave Coldwater Flats standing in stunned silence when the truth of it finally came into the light. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Winifred Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to know. We're not so far apart after all. Winifred had not always been a widow, and she had not always been poor. She was born Winifred Ann Hargrove in 1858 in a low farmhouse outside Emporia, the third of 5 children to a father who mended harness leather for half the county and a mother who kept bees and quilted and believed, with a plain and unshaken certainty, that nothing God made was ever truly worthless. Not a bent nail, not a cracked jar, not a bruised apple, and certainly not a person the world had decided to overlook. It was her mother, Ruth Hargrove, who taught her to see value where others saw ruin, kneeling beside her in the garden to show her how a broken-backed hoe could be reforged into something finer, how a chipped plate could still hold a meal with dignity, how the things folks threw away often held more good use left in them than the things they kept. Winifred grew up with calloused hands and a quick mind for machinery, an unusual gift for a girl in that place and time. But her father never discouraged it. He let her work the bellows in his little forge shed, let her take apart a broken clock, just to see if she could put it back together. And by the time she was 16, she could diagnose a stalled well pump, faster than most men twice her age. It was this same gift that had first drawn Thomas Calloway to her, a quiet, steady young rancher from Coldwater Flats, who had come through Emporia buying cattle and stayed 3 extra days because he could not stop watching the harness mender's daughter fix a seized wagon axle with nothing but grease, patience, and an iron will. They married in the spring of 1879, and Thomas brought her home to the ranch his own father had carved out of the Kansas prairie. A modest spread of grassland and one good well, bordered on its northern edge by an older homestead that had been abandoned even before Thomas's father arrived. A strange, half-forgotten plot, with a windmill standing crooked against the sky, built, folks said, by an eccentric drifter-inventor named Ezra Whitlock, who had vanished some time before the war and left his tower rusting in the wind. Thomas used to tell her, half-joking, that old Whitlock's windmill was cursed or blessed, nobody could ever agree which, because it stood through droughts and prairie fires that flattened everything around it, and no one in 3 decades had ever managed to get the thing running again. Winifred loved her husband plainly and without complication for 8 quiet years. They had no children, a sorrow she carried privately, but they had good land, a strong marriage, and a small, steady prosperity built on Thomas's careful management and her own relentless capability. She ran the ledgers, doctored the animals, and mended every piece of broken equipment on the place herself, earning a reputation among the ranch hands as a woman who could fix nearly anything, except perhaps her own quiet loneliness. It was her mother's lessons that had shaped her most, that worth was not always visible on the surface, that a thing cast aside by one generation might still hold everything needed by the next, if only someone had the patience and the eye to look. She did not know, in those peaceful years, how soon she would need every ounce of that patience, simply to survive. The fall came suddenly, the way prairie storms did, with almost no warning at all. Thomas took ill in the summer of 1887, a fever that the county doctor called simply a wasting sickness of the blood. And within 6 weeks, the strong, steady man who had built his life alongside her was gone, leaving Winifred, a widow at 29, with a ranch, a herd, and a grief so total she could barely rise from bed some mornings. She had scarcely begun to grieve properly before Silas Calloway arrived, Thomas's older brother, a man who had left Coldwater Flats 15 years earlier under some falling out nobody spoke of directly, and had built himself a comfortable life in Topeka as a man who understood paperwork better than he understood people. Silas produced, with the help of a banker named Hollis Pruitt, who ran the only bank for 30 miles in any direction, a note supposedly signed by Thomas's late father years before, claiming an old debt against the ranch that had never been settled, a debt so conveniently large that it swallowed the entire property whole. Winifred protested that she had never seen such a note in 8 years of keeping the family's books, that Thomas's father had died solvent and clear, that something about the signature looked wrong to her trained eye, thin and careful in a way that didn't match the bold, impatient hand she remembered from old letters in the strongbox. But she was a widow without a lawyer, without money for one, and without a single soul in the county willing to stand against Hollis Pruitt, who held half the mortgages in the district, and had a way of making sure anyone who crossed him found their own credit mysteriously called due the following spring. The sheriff, an exhausted, unimaginative man named Otis Renner, who owed his own modest cattle loan to Pruitt's bank, signed the paper without much apparent thought, and gave her 1 week to vacate. She spent that week going through every drawer and box in the house, searching for something, anything, that might prove the note false. But if such proof existed, she could not find it in 7 days of frantic searching, and on the 8th morning, she loaded her trunk onto a borrowed wagon and left the only home she had known as a married woman, driving past the crooked shape of old Whitlock's windmill on the property line without even glancing at it, her mind entirely consumed by loss. She took a small room above the Coldwater Flats Mercantile, paid for with money scraped from selling her wedding china to a traveling peddler, and within a month, she had exactly $11 left between herself and true destitution, no family nearby to take her in, and a town that watched her with the particular mixture of pity and suspicion that small places reserve for women whose fortunes have collapsed too quickly to explain. It was in that condition, with autumn cooling the prairie grass to gold, and her landlady beginning to ask pointed questions about next month's rent, that Winifred heard the county was auctioning off several abandoned parcels for unpaid taxes, including, almost as an afterthought on the list, the old Whitlock homestead that bordered what had once been her own land. She walked the 2 miles out to the auction grounds, not because she had any plan, but because idleness had become unbearable, and because some small, stubborn part of her mother's teaching still whispered that a woman who understood machines might yet find some use for herself in a hard world. The auctioneer moved quickly through parcels nobody wanted, and when he came to the Whitlock lot, he barely paused, noting only that the land itself reverted to the county grazing commons, and that the sole remaining structure, a derelict windmill of no discernible value, would be sold separately for scrap to whoever wanted the trouble of hauling it away. Nobody bid. The tower had not turned in 30 years. Its blades were bent, its gearing frozen solid with rust, and the whole assembly leaned at an angle that suggested it might collapse in the next strong wind. But Winifred found herself remembering, with sudden clarity, the way Thomas used to speak of it fondly, despite its uselessness, calling it Old Whitlock's Folly, and remembering too her mother's hands turning a broken hoe into something whole again, and before she had entirely decided to speak, she heard her own voice call out $4, which was, absurdly, nearly half of everything she owned in the world. The auctioneer, surprised, gavelled it to her at once, and several onlookers laughed openly, one woman remarking loud enough to be heard that the widow Calloway had gone from losing a whole ranch to buying a rust heap, and wasn't that just the saddest thing? Winifred said nothing in reply. She walked the 2 miles back to arrange for a hired wagon and 2 strong men, spending nearly her last dollar to have the windmill's tower and blades hauled into town behind the mercantile, where her landlady, a kind but practical widow named Agatha Munn, allowed her to store it in the yard on the promise that she would find some way to make it useful or else remove it by spring. That first evening, alone in the fading light, Winifred climbed up onto the fallen assembly with a rag and a can of oil, simply to see what 30 years of neglect had done to Ezra Whitlock's strange invention. And it was there, working her fingers along the seam of the largest blade, that she felt something that should not have been there at all. A faint seam, too straight and too deliberate to be a manufacturing flaw, running along the blade's trailing edge like a hidden hinge. She spent 3 full days working at that seam before it finally gave way, prying at it first with a kitchen knife, and then, more carefully, with a thin, flat file borrowed from the blacksmith down the street, a broad, quiet man named Josiah Fentress, who had watched her efforts with growing curiosity and, eventually, simply handed her his best tools without asking many questions, sensing correctly that this was not idle tinkering, but something that mattered to her. When the seam finally opened, it revealed that the blade itself was not solid at all, but hollow, a clever piece of engineering that seemed almost too deliberate for a simple farm windmill. And, inside that hollow chamber, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, but still remarkably intact, she found a small bundle of papers and a battered tin box no larger than a hymnal. Her hands shook as she carried the bundle inside, away from the wind, and unwrapped it on Agatha Munn's kitchen table by lamplight. Inside the oilcloth were letters, perhaps a dozen of them, written in a careful, educated hand, and dated across a span of years in the late 1850s and 1860s, along with a set of surveyor's papers, a hand-drawn map of the county's original water sources, and a formal-looking document bearing the wax-cracked seal of the Territorial Land Office. As she read late into that first night, a picture began to assemble itself that made her breath come short. Ezra Whitlock, it seemed, had not been merely an eccentric drifter, as local legend remembered him, but a trained engineer who had come west, specifically to survey the region's water table before the great rush of settlement. And the documents in her hands were nothing less than the original water rights agreement for the entire Coldwater Flats Basin. An agreement drawn up and witnessed by 3 founding families including the Whitlocks and, astonishingly, the early Callaways themselves, establishing that the underground springs feeding the whole valley were to remain a shared common resource, free to any settler who dug a well upon it, protected explicitly against any single party ever damming, diverting, or claiming exclusive rights to the water beneath the earth. One letter, written in Whitlock's own hand and addressed to no one in particular, as though composed simply to preserve the truth for whoever might someday find it, explained with growing anguish that a young banker new to the territory, a man named Hollis Pruitt, had begun quietly buying up land along the spring's natural course, and had petitioned the territorial office to have the original agreement declared lost or void, intending to build a private dam and charge the town for water that had once been free. Whitlock wrote that he had hidden the original documents rather than surrender them, fearing Pruitt's growing influence over the fledgling county government, and that he intended to bring them before a proper judge as soon as one could be found who was not already indebted to the man. Whitlock had never gotten the chance. The last letter in the bundle, written in a different, shakier hand that Winifred did not recognize, noted only that Mr. Whitlock had gone missing during the difficulties of the war years, and that his homestead had reverted to the county for lack of an heir. And there, the trail went cold. 30 years of silence, sealed inside a hollow iron blade, while the very water rights it protected had, in that same span of years, somehow come entirely under the control of the Coldwater Flats Bank. The full weight of what she held did not settle on Winifred all at once, but grew heavier over the following days as she cross-referenced the old documents against what she already knew of the town's present arrangements, sitting up late with Agatha Munn's help tracing names and dates by candlelight. It became clear that Hollis Pruitt, the very same Hollis Pruitt, now an old but still formidable man who had helped Silas Calloway seize her ranch with that convenient debt note, had spent 3 decades quietly consolidating control over the valley's water. The public spring that fed the town well had been dammed upstream in the 1860s under a private company Pruitt controlled, and ever since, every rancher and farmer in the basin paid an annual water maintenance fee to his bank for access that Ezra Whitlock's original agreement said should have cost them nothing at all. It explained things Winifred had never questioned before: why dry years always seemed to squeeze the small ranchers hardest while Pruitt's own cattle interests flourished, why families who fell behind on the water fee often found themselves suddenly behind on their banknotes as well, and why, she now suspected with a cold clarity, the note used to seize her own ranch might not have been the only forged document Hollis Pruitt had ever produced. She began to understand that Ezra Whitlock's Windmill had not merely hidden a secret, it had hidden the truth of an entire town's quiet servitude, and that the $4 she'd spent as an act of half-desperate sentiment had placed in her hands the one thing capable of setting it right. But she also understood, with equal clarity, how dangerous that truth might be to speak aloud. Pruitt was not a man who would simply apologize and hand back 30 years of profit. He had already shown, through Silas, exactly how far he would go to protect what he considered his. Winifred did not act rashly. She spent nearly 2 weeks quietly verifying every document against public county records, traveling once by wagon all the way to the territorial land office in the county seat, where a patient young clerk named Bertram Ackley, moved by her careful, methodical questions, helped her locate the original 1858 filing that Whitlock's letter had described, and found, exactly as promised, an official notation from years later declaring the file lost, presumed destroyed under a request submitted by one H. Pruitt. The forgery, or at least the manipulation, was no longer a suspicion but a documented fact. Armed with this, she returned to Coldwater Flats, and made the mistake, perhaps, of trusting one confidant too many. She mentioned her discovery to a shopkeeper's wife she had known kindly for years, not realizing the woman's husband held a note with Pruitt's bank, and would, within a day, feel obligated to mention it to the man himself out of simple fear. Word reached Hollis Pruitt faster than Winifred expected, and within 3 days, Silas Calloway himself appeared at Agatha Munn's boarding house, no longer indifferent, but openly threatening, informing Winifred that continuing to spread wild stories about respectable men would see her run out of the county entirely, and reminding her, with a coldness that chilled her more than any shout could have, that a woman alone with no family and no money had very little standing to make accusations against men of property. Pruitt himself sent no direct threat, being too careful for that, but the town's mood shifted almost overnight. The mercantile owner, who had extended her small credit, suddenly required payment in full. Agatha Munn was quietly warned by a bank clerk that her boarding house loan might be reviewed if she continued housing troublemakers, and Winifred found herself, for the first time since her husband's death, truly afraid, not merely of poverty, but of being erased entirely, dismissed as a grieving, half-mad widow whose claims could be smiled away and forgotten. It was Josiah Fentress, the blacksmith, of all people, who steadied her in that hardest week, reminding her plainly one evening, as she sat exhausted in his shop, that Ezra Whitlock had hidden that truth for 30 years, hoping someday someone honest would find it, and that, giving up now, out of fear, would only prove Pruitt right, that such truths were better left buried. Fentress himself had quietly resented paying the water fee for 15 years, and offered, that same night, to stand beside her when the time came. The first crack in what had seemed an impenetrable wall of town complicity. The reckoning came on a cold morning in late November, at a public meeting called ostensibly to discuss the county's winter grazing allotments, but which Winifred, through Bertram Ackley's careful arrangement, had ensured would include a circuit judge passing through on his regular rounds, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Calvin Reeve, who had no particular loyalty to Pruitt's bank, and, more importantly, an unbending reputation for despising fraud of any kind. Winifred stood before nearly 60 of her neighbors in the drafty Grange Hall, her hands steady though her voice trembled at first, and laid out Ezra Whitlock's letters, the original water rights agreement, the county land office's own confirming record of the lost file, and finally, most damning of all, a side-by-side comparison she and Josiah Fentress had painstakingly assembled of the signature on the debt note used to seize her ranch against genuine signatures of Thomas's father preserved in old church and county records, a comparison that any honest eye could see did not match. Hollis Pruitt, present in the hall, and clearly having believed the matter already smothered, rose to object with practiced smoothness, but Judge Reeve, examining the documents himself with slow, deliberate care, asked Pruitt directly to explain why he had petitioned to have a founding water agreement declared lost 30 years earlier. And Pruitt's confident answers began, for the first time in anyone's memory, to falter under real scrutiny. The room, which had begun the meeting murmuring with polite skepticism toward the widow Calloway, grew utterly silent as the truth assembled itself piece by piece before them, silent in the particular way of people realizing they had, without ever quite meaning to, spent decades paying for something that had once belonged freely to them all. Judge Reeve did not rule everything settled that single morning, for matters of law take their proper time, but he ordered the water company's private dam records seized for review, referred the debt note question to the territorial prosecutor's office, and, most immediately and most importantly for Winifred, issued an injunction halting the collection of any further water fees from the valley's ranchers and farmers pending full investigation, an order that, within that same hour, effectively broke Hollis Pruitt's 30-year grip on the town's most essential resource in front of every witness who had once been too afraid to challenge him. In the months that followed, as the full investigation unwound Pruitt's affairs, and eventually stripped him of his bank charter entirely, replacing him with honest county oversight of the water company he had once controlled outright, Winifred did not seek to reclaim her old ranch through vengeance or spite, though the law did in time restore it to her once the forged debt note was formally invalidated, and Silas Calloway, disgraced and unable to show his face in a town that now knew the whole shape of his brother's ruin, quietly returned to Topeka and was never spoken of again in Coldwater Flats. Instead, Winifred used what she had recovered, both the land and, more precious still, the standing her courage had earned her among her neighbors, to see that Ezra Whitlock's original vision was finally honored rather than merely restored to a different owner's ledger. She donated the old homestead parcel back to the county as protected common ground around the spring itself, ensuring by careful legal language, drafted with Bertram Ackley's patient help, that no single family or bank could ever again claim exclusive rights to what fed the whole valley, and she oversaw, with Josiah Fentress's skilled hands and her own inherited gift for machinery, the repair of the very windmill that had held the secret, restoring it not to a private lot, but to a place at the center of the newly designated commons, where it turned steadily in the prairie wind as a plain, working monument that anyone passing could see and understand. And so it was that Winifred Calloway, who had begun that autumn as a widow of 29 with $11 and no home, cast off by her own husband's family, and mocked gently by a town that assumed her $4 purchase was the last foolish act of a grieving woman, became instead the person who returned to Coldwater Flats, something it had not known it was missing, not merely water, though that mattered enormously to families who had struggled under an unfair burden for years longer than they realized, but the simple, restored knowledge that value does not always announce itself plainly, that a thing bent and rusted and laughed at in an auction yard might still hold, hidden in its very bones, the means to set an old wrong right. She thought often, in the years after, of her mother kneeling beside her in a garden outside Emporia, teaching her that nothing made carefully was ever truly worthless, only waiting, sometimes for decades, for someone patient enough to look closely and see what remained. She thought, too, of Ezra Whitlock, a man she never met and never could, who had trusted that some future stranger would care enough to open what he had sealed away, and she made certain, in the small ceremony held the following spring to formally dedicate the restored commons, that his name was spoken aloud before the whole gathered town, so that the truth he had guarded so carefully at such personal cost would never again be lost to silence. We hope Winifred's story stayed with you a while, the way the best of these old prairie stories tend to. If you found something in it, a bit of courage, a reminder that worth isn't always visible at first glance, or simply a good hour of company on a quiet evening, we'd be glad if you'd share it with someone who might need it too. We'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments. We read every one, and we're always glad for the company. Until next time, stay close.